the creationist institutions that birthed out of the 70s and 80s, initially their goal was to disprove evolution. But they found out fairly quickly that could not be done. So they switched gears and they began to portray evolution as the root of all cultural ills. All of a sudden, creation science morphed into a culture war. And that began to be the version of creationism going forward into where we are now.
Welcome, everybody, back to the podcast. We've got another excellent episode for you today. My guest on today's episode is Dr. Janet Kellogg Ray. She is an incredible communicator of the relationship between science and faith. She has multiple decades of experience teaching biology in the college classroom, and she's just an incredible writer and communicator when it comes to talking about science, what science is, and how it relates to the Christian faith. So really excited to chat with her on this episode. We're talking about her new book, The God of Monkey Science, which is a really fun read. I highly encourage you to get the book. It's got a list of discussion questions in the back that you can work through if you're doing like a book study group or some kind of small group study. Really, really great stuff, all designed to help us walk through what science is saying about origins, the relationship of species in the world, and how we might think about that theologically. So really excited. Her previous book's also a great read. I'd encourage you to look at that. Baby Dinosaurs on the Ark, ? So this is kind of part 2 for that. So we get into a great conversation, covers a lot of kind of the tenor of the book, which is exploring, history of American evangelicalism, relationship with science, some major events, some major players in terms of how the conversation was shaped, what science is and isn't, how we can think about the relationship between science and faith, what we can do productively as Christians if we're part of communities that are maybe have an anti-scientific bent, and how we can have productive conversations with our friends and family. So really looking forward to this conversation. Before we hop in, make sure that you are subscribed to our channel if you haven't done so already, and turn on your notifications. That makes sure that you are getting all of our content when it drops. Please do give us a like and comment as well so that we can engage with you. Let us know what you liked. Let us know what you'd like to see in future episodes. We're always open to feedback. This is a tool and a resource ultimately for you all, the listeners and the viewers, and I want to make it as good as it possibly can be for you. So please do make sure that you've subscribed to our channel if you haven't done so already. And with that, and without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into our conversation with Dr. Ray. Welcome back, everybody, to the podcast. Super excited today to have another excellent guest, Dr. Janet Kellogg Ray. So excited to have her. She's got a new book coming out, which we're going to be talking about. Thanks so much, Janet, for being here. It's just such a delight, such a treat.
Thanks, Max. Thanks for inviting me.
So to get us started, would you mind sharing just a little bit about your story, faith journey, and particularly how you came to be so passionate in terms of the sciences and being a science educator and somebody who doesn't just talk about science, but really the intersection of science and faith?
Sure. I grew up in a very conservative, fundamentalist precinct of Christianity in the mainstream churches of Christ. Our church congregation was absolutely central to my family growing up. We went to church 3 times a week and every day of the week if it was a gospel meeting. And I like to say probably the most scarring thing about that upbringing was that I never saw The Wizard of Oz until I was an adult. Because back in the day, before streaming, Wizard of Oz only broadcast on Sunday night. And we were never home on Sunday night. So, but in my church tradition, in which I was raised, we took church seriously. We took the Bible very seriously and literally. And so I honestly don't remember any time evolution being specifically denigrated from the pulpit or science in general, primarily because it was just the default position, a literal 6-day special creation was the default position. And we would no more have questioned that than we would have questioned the existence of Jesus. And so that was my earliest memories of what church and Bible was like. When I was in middle school, believe it or not, the state of Texas did not require science for 7th graders. It was an elective. And I decided I wanted to take choir because it sounded fun. However, my dad was a teacher in my school, and he was very disciplined, and he didn't like the lack of discipline that he saw in the choir room. And so he put me in the science elective. And to this day, I credit him with changing the trajectory of my life. It was an amazing science class for a 7th grade school. We did real dissections. We worked our way through what we called the animal kingdom at the time. And I distinctly remember having thoughts, no vocabulary at all to express these thoughts. But I definitely remember having thoughts that these animals seem really connected somehow, and that they are animals. I mean, before I took this class, animals were things like puppies and kitties and things like fur, but we were looking at sea stars and earthworms and insects, and it became apparent that these animals were connected in a deeper way other than just that's what we were doing in class. It looked like the systems were being reworked and retooled, and were just variations on more primitive versions of those symptoms. Now, again, I had no vocabulary to express those questions, but I definitely remember thinking those things. So on into high school, kind of having those same thoughts, but again, no vocabulary to express it. I went on to university, to a Christian university, which I loved, I still love. I was a biology major. And my freshman year of university, a professor who ended up being my absolute favorite professor while I was there, I took several classes from him, I taught labs for him. But I distinctly remember him telling us as freshmen, here's the section in the textbook on evolution. You need to know about it. And that was it. And so, again, I had just kind of made my peace with everything, and I kind of had a mindset of, if I can just close one eye and squint, maybe I can make the fossil record match the Genesis creation story. And I just didn't really address these questions that were percolating in the back of my mind until just a few years after my husband and I graduated from our Christian university. We were both biology majors. A few years after we graduated, a young earth creationist who had no connection to our university at all decided to come in with guns blazing and ruin the careers of two of the professors, including the man who was my favorite professor. One of the professors was a tough old guy, and he withstood the storm. But the professor that I worked for was a very gentle man, and it devastated him. It humiliated him. And a couple of years ago, I had the opportunity to go back and speak at my Christian university in chapel of all places about science and faith. And I had the opportunity to speak to a faculty member who was there at the time when all of this happened. And he said the ironic thing was that this professor was so religiously conservative, he squeaked. But he was a man of science. And he was telling his biology students about evolution. Unfortunately, it ruined him. He resigned, and he actually passed away a few years after that. It was tragic what happened to this man. And that was a motivating factor for me, for my husband. From that point on, we decided that we needed to know what was going on with this. We had these degrees in biology, but had never been trained in evolutionary theory. So we started reading on our own, listening, reading more, and the rest is history. I began to write a blog. I spoke some at church and classes, usually more of a soft sell there. And the rest is history. Here we are.
Wow. It's a really powerful story. And, just a reminder of how tenuous it can be to teach science in a Christian environment. I sometimes feel like I'm walking on eggshells sometimes teaching Bible in a Christian environment, ironically, because of some historical conversations and other conversations that come up. But science is a whole nother ballgame. I do not envy scientists. And it sounds like he was pretty cautious even in the way that he presented it. So,
absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think he, in a few years after we graduated, I think he had gotten more specific. If any, a good that came out of that story was that the science faculty stood together, and within a few years, they said, "We are a science department. We are not a Bible college, and we will be intellectually honest." And to this day, that university, Abilene Christian University, teaches evolution as the foundational principle of all biology. And like I said, they brought me in to speak about it specifically, even in biology chapels. So I think it was a defining point for a lot of people of faith who are also people of science.
Yeah, that's great. And you include in the book a number of statements from CCCU schools that I think do a good job of framing that issue up for their students. Yep. So it's great.
Right.
Okay, well, thanks for that intro. That's really, really helpful. So the book is The God of Monkey Science, right? Is that did I get that right? Yeah.
That's it.
And following up on, you've got great titles. The previous one, right, were there baby dinosaurs on the ark? So I love that.
Yeah.
Did I get that right? Yeah.
Baby dinosaurs on the ark. That's what it is. Yeah.
Question mark. Yeah. I love it.
Yeah.
So yeah. Love the title. So, could you give us a little bit of insight into the motivation for the book and whom you're trying to reach with the book? I think we get a good sense of that in the discussion questions we see at the end, which is one of the things I really love about the book. If you're considering the book, it's a great opportunity. There's some really awesome discussion questions that you can walk through in groups, have some really rich time together. So we've got the discussion questions. It's definitely I'm writing from the inside of a faith tradition to my faith tradition, but just anything you want to speak into in terms of the motivation for the book and what you're hoping to accomplish through the book.
Right. Baby Dinosaurs on the Ark was about to be released it was released in the fall of 2021. But back in the spring of 2021, all of us were in the middle of our COVID experience. We didn't know it at the time that we were in the middle of it, but in retrospect, we were. And so during the time that we were just in the midst of COVID, the vaccine had just been released. My book about evolution denial, the baby dinosaurs on the ark, was going through its final edits. So that was my context. And so as it is, when you write things for others to read, I was in a kind of a group chat, group discussion, because the governor of Texas had just rolled back the mask mandate for the state of Texas. And only at that time, vaccination rates were in single digits. And so this was just a chat discussion, people kind of weighing in on their thoughts. And, I think I said something really science nerdy like, go ribosomes, go, get your vaccine, something like that. But there was an individual on this chat who I know to be anti-vaccine, and that's just this individual. And she made the comment, "There she goes again, Janet and her monkey god science." And honestly, I wasn't offended. I was just perplexed because we weren't talking about evolution. We were talking about vaccines and public health and the science behind it. And so that perplexed me. And so I spent the rest of 2021 reading and researching and trying to discover why there seemed to be this overlap between evolution denial, all things COVID denial, and then dropping down into that mix, denial of human involvement in climate warming. And so what I found was that although evolution was the first science that offended evangelicals, fighting evolution for so long formed an entire way of talking about science and talking about scientists. You know, usually when we talk about conflict between science and faith, everyone wants to go back to the Galileo incident, which was interesting. But the Galileo incident did not have nearly the shockwaves that went through Christianity, and specifically evangelical precincts of Christianity, that the Scopes trial, called the Scopes monkey trial, did in the 1920s. And this was also perplexing to me. Darwin had been dead for decades at the time of the Scopes trial. His books, his publications had been out for decades. So why then? You know, why now? Why in the 1920s did this all of a sudden become the source of so much evangelical angst? You know, we've got to understand that it wasn't just Darwin that was making waves. It was this perfect storm of not only Darwin's writings, but at the same time Darwin was writing, there were these theologians in Germany who were writing new things about the Bible to many people. It's commonly known as historical biblical criticism, where the Bible was being looked at within its ancient context. And so by the time we get to the early 20th century, in the time of the Scopes trial, we have these intellectual elites in their ivory towers telling us that the Bible is not the actual dictated words from the mouth of God. And then we have these scientists telling us that we came from monkeys. And so you have this perfect storm coming together, becoming part of the public consciousness. And the result of that was what we know as the Scopes monkey trial. But it's important to note that in this trial, there were no scientists that testified. There was no science evidence entered into the record.
Wasn't William James wasn't Brian an actor, if I recall, like the prosecuting attorney?
He was an orator, is usually how I saw him. Described as an orator, but he was very popular. They called him the great commoner. You know, if he were alive today, he'd have a talk radio show, no doubt, or he'd be have his own cable interview show. But William Jennings Bryan, you're exactly right. He was seen by the people as a commoner, as the common man. He didn't speak the words of scientists. He spoke the language of the people. And as such, during the Scopes trial, he had his opinions on evolution were basically threefold. There's no evidence for it, and scientists don't even support it. Brian characterized those who supported evolution as being enemies of the Bible. And then this is a big one here. Brian said that because the people who are anti-evolution are in the majority, their rights are being violated when evolution is taught in public schools. And so there's no evidence for evolution, it's anti-religion, and it violates rights. Those were Brian's talking points. And fast forward to the 21st century, And it's like we can find argument fossils embedded in science denial of COVID science and climate science. We still see Bryant's talking points. Science evidence is sketchy or simply wrong, or science in some ways threatens our faith or results in atheism. And here's the one that just amazed me, is that acceptance of science evidence is going to come at a cost to personal freedoms and your personal rights. We are just using the same arguments, talking about science in the same way that we have for 100 years. And it all goes back to Bryant speaking the language of the people, not speaking the language of science. And we developed a whole way of approaching science and a whole way of thinking about the work of scientists. So, it was just, amazing to me, the pieces that started coming together about why evolution and the pandemic and climate science just seem to be part of this package deal.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, massive distrust of science, of expertise, and an affinity for bumper stickers and slogans as arguments, right? Like,
right.
What did he had some great one-liners in there, like,
of course.
I don't need to know the age of the rocks. I know the rock of ages, and all this, this kind of stuff. It's just great.
Right.
Rolls off the tongue. It sounds like a preacher, Yeah.
Yeah. Well, he was an orator. That was entertainment. In those days, you went to hear a big orator speak. It was fun. But I'm glad you brought that up about his quote about the age of the earth and rock of ages. Interestingly, the version of creationism that we have today was not the version of creationism argued by Bryant in the Scopes trial. The modern version of creationism was actually birthed in the 1970s and early 1980s in the United States. And that is the version of creationism that the United States has exported to parts of Europe, to Australia, to Canada. You're very welcome. But that was all born in the late 1970s, early 1980s. And it took a different tact toward creationism. Starting in the 70s and 80s, creation science became the phrase, connecting the word creation not just as a religious concept, but as a scientific concept. So in all of the creationist institutions that birthed out of the 70s and 80s, initially their goal was to disprove evolution. But they found out fairly quickly that could not be done. So they switched gears and they began to portray evolution as the root of all cultural ills. All of a sudden, creation science morphed into a culture war. And that began to be the version of creationism going forward into where we are now. Evolution was seen as the root cause of abortion and homosexuality. Evolution was blamed for school shootings, even disobedient children. It became easier to blame evolution for all of the cultural ills that we identified than to disprove evolution. So along comes a pandemic, and what do? We don't address the science, we address the cultural problems of it. They're shutting down our churches. They're making us wear masks. They are violating our constitutional rights by saying that we can't meet in person during the height of a pre-vaccine pandemic. They're telling us that we have to take a vaccine instead of trusting in the blood of Jesus to protect us. Climate science.
I heard that one, by the way. There's a huge church by where we lived in Michigan, and the teaching coming out of there, either officially or unofficially, was the blood of Jesus, like the lamb's blood, is covering the doors of the house of believers and protecting them from the virus.
Absolutely, absolutely. The COVID pandemic was a textbook case of baptizing our culture wars, baptizing our anti-science positions, and making it a religious fight instead of what it was a cultural fight. Climate science, we don't argue against the science evidence there either. It's because culture, it threatens our rights. It threatens our rights to drive a big old truck, even if we don't need it for work. It's threatening our gas stoves. And most recently, it's threatening our ceiling fans, our very American way of life. And so when science became a front in culture wars, we saw a whole way of talking about science that was birthed back in the 1920s, but really became the culture war in the 70s and 80s.
Yeah, that's really helpful background. And I think you stated so well that once it becomes a culture war, it becomes a different kind of conversation and more rhetorically effective, more powerful. And it's such a good reminder, to many who might not be aware. The standard evangelical position on science leading up to the Scopes trial was pretty open-ended. I mean, you had people who were part of a very conservative theological school, the old Princeton school, who were more than open to God working through evolutionary processes. And then even after the Scopes trial, some of the most popular thinkers and shapers of American evangelicalism, like Scofield, the Scofield Study Bible, they were not young 7-day creationists. No. They were old earthers, gap theorists. Right. And so, there's some development here and some shaping that's going on. And I know you're aware of this, but for our listeners and viewers, when you go to the Ken Ham's Creation Museum, I haven't been there, but from the accounts I've heard, the first part you walk through is the downward spiral of culture, telling the story of evolution, beginning this downward spiral of culture before you even get into, the rest of the stuff that's going on. So it's very interesting connections.
Right.
Yeah.
It's that argument fossil again. We're not going to argue the science of evolution. We're going to argue that evolution is bad for culture.
So you do a great job in the book. I mean, you write so clearly. It's an enthralling read, really fun and engaging. And it's a wonderful combination of science and cultural analysis kind of wedded together, which I really love. So one of the things you discuss is, as a science educator, here's how science actually works. And and it's important for people to understand every discipline has limits, has a scope, has an aim. And I mean, that's one thing I'm constantly talking about with my Bible students as well. There are different ways we know things. Certain tools do different things. So could you unpack for a little bit of, unpack a little bit of how you lay out the scope of science in the book? And maybe also, could you correct the popular misunderstanding that we find, particularly in evangelical circles, around the term theory as it relates to science, right? So if something's a theory, it's just, I hold to it as that's my opinion, basically, is what that means. But theory has a different sense, right, when we're talking about scientific data. So
Right. Yeah, absolutely. There is a popular usage of the word theory, and there's the use of the term theory the way scientists use it. I like to hit this strong and hard on the first day of the semester in all of my classes. And just last night was the opening game of the Dallas Cowboys, my team. And, I can say that it was great. It was great. And so, I can say, my theory is that my Cowboys are going to win it all this year. But that's not the way a scientist would talk about a theory. That's more hopeful or wishful thinking on a Cowboys fan part. But I also tell my classes on the first day of every semester that I don't believe in science. And usually gets kind of quiet, and they kind of think, is it too late to drop this class? The professor doesn't believe in science. But I try to make the point that I don't believe in science, because a fact is true whether I believe it or not. Instead, I accept science evidence. I can believe that the earth is flat, but that doesn't change the fact that the earth is a sphere, more or less. And so I try to make the distinction between things that I accept and things that I believe. And that there are things in my life, the most important things in my life are things that I believe, but they aren't science. And you're absolutely right about still having across the board this misconception about what science means when it uses the term theory. And you always see that phrase, it's just a theory. In fact, there are still school districts in 2023 that require a sticker to be slapped on the cover of biology textbooks that says, this textbook discusses evolution. Evolution is a theory, not a fact. Which, huge red flag for misunderstanding what science means by theory and fact. Even in public schools, there are some districts that require that sticker. But, to those that would do that, I would say, would you jump out of an airplane without a parachute? I wouldn't jump out with a parachute, but would you jump out of a plane without a parachute because gravity is just a theory? If you were going to have surgery and your surgeon rushed into the room and said, I'm really running late, do you mind if I don't wash my hands or sterilize my instruments today? After all, germ theory is just a theory. We would all understand that would be a misuse of the term theory. But somehow, evolution falls into this category of doubt that it's a theory and not a fact. And actually, if you were going to rank science terms, theories rank above facts because it's theories that make sense of the facts that we see. And so we see things like in state school boards, boards of education, local boards of education, things like teach the strengths and weaknesses of theory. Now, evolution is never specifically named, but I guarantee you nobody is suggesting that we debate photosynthesis or that we debate gravity. The theory that in question there is always evolution, and more so these days, also including climate science.
Yeah.
And it's, as a science educator, this really concerns me because when we don't understand what science means by theory, and that science theories are actually the foundational principles of an area of science, that although they may be tweaked and changed at the frontiers of our knowledge, substantially, they are not going to change. We're not going to go back and say it's really bad air that makes us sick. We're going to stick with germ theory, and we're going to work from there. But one problem that this has resulted in over the years of denying evolution is that we approach science with foregone conclusions. Just a couple of weeks ago, I saw on social media, someone had posted this statement: you will find evidence for a global flood if you just look for it. And so taking a stance of creationism, or even the intelligent design version of creationism, in order to do what is called by advocates of these positions science, you have to approach the evidence with foregone conclusions. In other words, you set out to find evidence for design, or you set out to find evidence of special creation. But that's just not how scientists work. In fact, scientists do all sorts of backflips to falsify their findings. You state your hypothesis at the end. You either rejected it or you failed to reject your hypothesis. It's all about falsifying your findings, your evidence. And so if you're approaching the evidence with foregone conclusions, you're not doing real science. And, and just as a side on that, I would also say a good science theory predicts new knowledge. And with this understanding, intelligent design, creationism, creation science cannot be a science, because if a design is something that is done by a designer, known only to the designer, why research? How do you predict new findings? Theories, the strength of a theory is that it has the ability to predict new knowledge or where new evidence is going to be found.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, so a theory is really an overall framework that has explanatory and predictive power.
Yes.
And the longer that a theory of facts, as you said, so it's a constellation of facts, not a single fact. And then the longer that a theory lasts within a tradition, a scientific model, the stronger really it becomes, in a sense, because it's been tested and prodded in so many different ways. Now, that's not to say that, of course, we do have what the philosopher Thomas Kuhn labeled paradigm shifts in science. These do happen every now and then. A major rediscovery causes a paradigm shift. But once you're within this tradition, right, like the burden for that kind of a shift happening has to be a tremendous amount of evidence to cause some kind of reframing of the whole paradigm or the whole framework, right?
Right. I mean, for example, modern genetics has revolutionized how we approach theory of evolution. Charles Darwin never even knew what a chromosome was, much less DNA. And so with the advent of modern genetics, we know so much more about how traits are handed down through generations and generations. However, it doesn't change the theory that says common ancestry, common descent with natural selection. Now, how those mechanisms, we understand more about them, and we understand more than it's just a single mutation that is leading to these variations, that there's lots of different ways genetically that variations arise. But what we are not going to do is to throw out common ancestry and natural selection.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. I asked this question one time to some different scientists coming at this from different positions. It was at a Christian theology conference, so it was an appropriate question for that setting. But I'd be curious to hear your answer to this, and maybe it's speculative because I'm asking you to answer what you think other people are doing. But you did bring up bringing the kind of a priori assumptions to the task of science and why that's a problem. I get the sense, and I could be wrong, and I don't want to misinterpret other people. I'm always careful about that. But I do get the sense that for a lot of scientists that are trying to come up with alternative models other than evolution, that what's driving that is their Christian faith or their convictions about reading the Bible. In other words, if they actually did what you're saying and bracket out faith considerations in the scientific process, because that's what that process requires, that they wouldn't feel the pressure to go a different route. In other words, if all they were doing was looking at the data, how likely is it that they would come up with the idea, oh yeah, the world's only 6,000 years old.
Right.
Dinosaurs and humans live together.
Yeah.
I don't know. What do you think about that? Do you think that is likely what's driving it? Is I just don't see any other way to maintain the authority of the Bible, and therefore what has to change is science.
There is a young earth creationist that a few years ago got into a lot of hot water with his fellow young earth creationist. His name is Todd Wood. I can't recall off the top of my head where he is a professor. But he wrote a long post on his website that said, evolution is not a theory in crisis. He went on to say there is evidence for evolution. He even said there's loads of evidence for evolution. And those statements are what got him in hot water. But then he goes on to say, the reason I reject evolution is not because of the evidence. It's because of my faith. And so he leaves it at that, and I can't remember how he went from that point. But basically, like I just mentioned, it's the approaching evidence with foregone conclusions. He just believes that eventually we will find evidence for special creation and a young earth. Mm-hmm. And this has always puzzled me, is that, I can give you several examples of how scientists just love to prove each other wrong. They love to prove, if you've got a Nobel Prize or not, if someone can find a flaw in your research, now they're going to be famous. And so it's not like scientists don't like to prove each other wrong. And so my question is always, if there is so much evidence for special creation, a young earth, intelligent design, then why do we not have any non-religious people advocating for those positions? There would be someone advocating for those positions that was not religious if there truly was evidence for design or for special creation or a young earth. And there's just not. There's just not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's really helpful. And good on him, at least for being clear about that. I think that kind of clarity is helpful because it opens up more opportunity for conversation. So I always find clarity to be a virtue. Even if we disagree, at least we're clear about why we're disagreeing. I think it's really helpful. And I run into the similar dynamic at a much lesser scale when it comes to biblical studies. I mean, you mentioned modern historical criticism and some of the issues that brings up when it comes to the Bible and history and so forth. And it's interesting to me, like they're just scholars that come at it from different perspectives, but there's definitely a strand of scholarship that comes at it from the perspective of, my reading of the Bible has to be first. And so if the archaeological data doesn't fit that, we just haven't discovered the right data yet, or the interpreters are corrupt or something like that, or or if it's a historical data thing, discrepancy thing, it's always the other stuff that's wrong. And you can do that, but the problem is as with science, so too with like history or any of the humanities, really, it's not a way of arguing that anyone else will really accept in the discipline. So you don't create a place for common conversation or knowledge because your a priori assumptions are so set that it basically undercuts the nature of any kind of public knowledge that we can have a conversation about, because you already have the right answer. You're just going and looking for the data to confirm your answer is basically the issue.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
We got into this a little bit already, but I'd love to unpack it a bit more. It's a major part of the book, and I think really helpful part of the book. You get into, talking about what I would call the American evangelical media complex. These greater than life personalities and institutions that kind of arise up and frame a culture, shape a culture of people to see science in a certain way. You talked about Brian already, and in many ways that's sort of like the template of how this works out. But not that we need to denigrate anybody, but you do name some names in the book, and it's helpful for listeners to be aware of that, because I always run into people in conversations like, oh, I'm going to this person or this museum or whatever, and I kind of internally wince a little bit. Like I want to share with you what some problems about that. Like when we have, let's have a conversation about that. Let's get to know these people and institutions a little bit so we can understand where they're coming from, and then you can decide whether that's for you or not. But yeah, anything you want to share about the dynamics that you unpack in the book?
Yeah, absolutely. Because we have made science a front in the culture wars, pastors, politicians, any kind of culture warrior becomes a more trusted voice in things like origins or a pandemic or climate science. These types of authority figures, pastors, politicians, culture warriors, become more trusted than are scientists. Because it's become all about a culture war. Remember, in the Scopes trial, there was no science that was entered into the testimony. And then here we are in the second decade of the 21st century, and we've got another compounding factor, this phenomenon that's popularly known as Christian nationalism. And so what we're finding now, there are several excellent researchers that are working now in the field of Christian nationalism. I read a lot of Perry and Whitehead's work.
They've got some great stuff out there. Yeah.
Right. And it's fascinating to me to see how often science denial tracks with attitudes of Christian nationalism. And, it's amazing. And if you look back historically over evolution denial from the 70s and 80s on, you see some of the same players, some of the same processes at work in this Christian nationalism phenomenon that you do with science denial. And, here, and like you said, not to denigrate anybody, but that this one's close because it's right here in Dallas, where I live and where I've lived for most of my adult life. There is a extremely large mega church in downtown Dallas, the First Baptist Church of Dallas. The pastor of the First Baptist Church of Dallas is named Robert Jeffress. Robert Jeffress is on lots and lots and lots of media. He was a spiritual advisor to President Trump, and throughout the 4 years of the Trump presidency, I don't think a week went by that he was not on somebody's cable TV show. While Trump was still president, Jeffress's church, the big sanctuary choir, sang at a rally for President Trump, then at the time President Trump. Not only did they sing, they sang an original anthem called, ready for this? Make America Great Again. And it's just as religion and state mixture as it sounds. To the Google for it. Read the lyrics for it. And so this is the mindset of that particular church as far as Christian nationalism goes. And it gets even better. First Baptist Church of Dallas holds a huge Freedom Sunday on the Sunday before the 4th of July. It's huge. I think you even have to get tickets to go to church that day. I'm not sure. But tens of thousands of people go.
Just as Jesus commanded us, right?
Right, and handed out American flags to every person in the sanctuary. So, envision all of this, all the patriotic songs, the military up front, American flags, and the icing on the cake is that all first-time visitors get a copy of Jeffress's book called Twilight's Last Gleaming, in which he spends pages and pages denigrating evolution and supporting young earth creationism. And so you have this melding of this Christian nationalism with science denial. And because we've been so conditioned to mistrust science and scientists, we're listening to these types of authorities. They are authorities, but they aren't experts, politicians, theologians, etc. And then Jeffress, it's not just about evolution with Jeffress. He's famous for mocking the teenage at the time climate activist Greta Thunberg, mocking her and telling her she needs to read her Bible and find out about God and the rainbow. And so there is just this alliance between those who would promote a version of Christianity that's very nationalistic and those who would deny this evidence of areas of modern science.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I think historically, that probably comes down to the way that certain issues, cultural, theological issues, get put in a bucket of like essentials for the evangelical movement. You see, that's the certain approach to science, end of the earth kind of stuff as well, cultural issues. It gets all melded together, and that's probably why we're seeing it manifest again, kind of all in the one jumbled sort of mess.
Right.
Yeah. So it just highlights your point that a lot of this really is a cultural issue more than anything. It's really not a question even. We're not even really talking about science at this point. It's just hey, this is what my culture believes, and we're gonna hold to that kind of thing. Yeah. Yeah, and it ties into another part of the book, which is very much connected with this whole deal. Mark Knoll described it as the scandal of the evangelical mind. Basically he says the scandal is there isn't much of an evangelical mind. And so it comes down to kind of the ways in which evangelical culture gets trained to approach higher education, to approach expertise. How do we see this playing out in science? It's cultural, but it's also, you already kind of alluded to this. There seems to be a trained doubt that people have of experts, and that, back to Brian being, you described him as a man of the common people. So you don't speak like an expert, also when it comes to Bible reading, right? I don't need expertise. I just read my Bible,
Right. Says what it says.
That way of thinking. It says what it says. So anything you want to say about that whole kind of anti-intellectual undercurrent that we find?
Right. Well, again, it goes back to those that perfect storm of issues that were happening at just the time that American evangelicalism was just gaining its foothold and was really defining itself. And that is reading the Bible in a different way than just every word is the literal word of God. And then Darwin telling us, there's another way to think about origins other than a literal Genesis story. And so with these two ideas coming together in one big intellectual crisis, this new evangelical network felt almost panicked in a way. We've got to get our leaders, our young people, our students away from these, what they saw as intellectual elites who were trying to destroy faith. It was theological elites trying to destroy the Bible, and it was academic elites who were trying to tell us that we came from monkeys, and we weren't the image of God, and that the Genesis account isn't literal. And so from that point on, evangelicals had to find ways to train pastors, to train leaders away from the influence of the ivory tower. And so we opened our own seminaries. We opened our own Bible colleges. We opened our own schools of preaching. And so the fallout of that is that we have generations of theologians and pastors who were trained outside of the broader academy. And not only that, those who trained them were also trained outside of the broader academy. And so what we see here in the 21st century is that there is a huge evangelical subculture. We have siloed ourselves off to the extent that we don't have to ever leave the silo. We don't ever have to let the bridges down and go to the outside. We built our own seminaries. We built our own Bible colleges. We built huge media corporations. We built publishing houses. You know, evangelical authors can write books, publish books, and have a built-in readership and do very, very well, thank you very much, and never leave the evangelical world. They write for an evangelical audience, they publish with evangelical publishing houses, and they're publicized through evangelical media. And so a person could go from Mother's Day out to a doctoral level degree and never leave the evangelical subculture of education. They could go their entire life and never read a religious book that wasn't published by an evangelical publishing house or written by an evangelical author. They could never study a Sunday school curriculum that was not written by an evangelical. And at some of the more strict precincts of evangelicalism, you will also see to this day in the 21st century warnings to parents about sending their kids off to secular universities. Right. You will even see warnings to stay away from many Christian universities. There are lists, not very long, fortunately, of approved colleges that still teach young earth creationism. And this doesn't just apply to the college level. Evangelicals are often encouraged to either send their kids to a private Christian school or, better yet, homeschool them so that they only hear young earth creationism. They are completely walled off from anything outside of that. And one downfall of that is that we never have to engage any other position from the actual position holders themselves. You know, I can't remember which, if I said this in this book or Baby Dinosaurs, but, you know, what I have found to be true is that what most people who reject evolution, what they know about evolution comes from anti-evolution resources. They've never addressed the topic from an actual position holder or an actual person who can explain the theory as scientists accept it. But instead, we only engage from positions that are against, for example, evolution. And, you know, all this is very ironic because despite this anti-intellectual mindset, this anti-intellectualism that percolates all through the history of American evangelicalism, there are many highly educated, highly intelligent evangelical leaders. You know, as a matter of fact, most large evangelical churches will insist on a doctorate level degree of some kind, or at least a master's level degree for their lead pastors. But most often, those doctoral level degrees are from isolated seminaries or Bible colleges. You know, for decades, we have educated our theologians and our pastors in isolation from other academic fields. So they have their evangelical training to be a pastor, to be a theologian, but what they haven't been exposed to is the philosophy and the arts and history and archaeology and science. And the people who are instructing them in seminary have likewise not been trained in the broader academy. Now, there are Christian universities who today in the 21st century want to be taken seriously as research institutions. And they agree that they cannot offer advanced degrees in their university if they don't, get out of the silo and join the broader academy and bring the theologians and the pastors that they train into contact with real work that's being done in the arts and in philosophy and in science. Now, many of those universities are tarred and feathered as being liberal, but so far, and I mentioned a few of them in the book, they've stood strong. And I'll tell you this one other thing, and I think you'll find it interesting, especially as a Bible professor and the archaeology, question coming up. I had a biology professor at my alma mater, Christian University, tell me one time that he has a far easier task in convincing students about the truth of evolution than do his colleagues at secular state universities do. Because when Christian students go into a state university, their guard is up. They've been warned. They're going to turn you into an atheist. And so their guard is up. But he said, here at a Christian university, I can tell them all about the science behind evolution. And they accept it from me because that level of trust is there, and they did not come in with their guard already up.
That's really interesting. Yeah. No, I could totally see that. I had experiences at both secular college and Christian college, and I have to say, I found the professors at the non-Christian college to be just wonderful, delightful people who are extremely open-minded. We're not, definitely not the villain from a God Is Not Dead film. So I think there's a little bit of we have this weird caricature sometimes of people, and again, it's because we're isolating ourselves from others and not just engaging our neighbors well. It's so funny to me.
Right.
But I also wonder, I think it's funny. I've observed this dynamic a lot in Christian higher ed where people really love it when someone is working there who got their PhD at some incredible non-Christian school. Like, did you know so-and-so has a Harvard PhD or a Yale PhD or something like that? Right. And then, so they love the prestige that comes along with the titles, but they don't want the person to actually think and teach like they got a Harvard PhD.
Right.
It's
exactly.
the weirdest dynamic. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think part of that also comes from, and I think you mentioned this before too, this pervasive idea of the underdog in evangelical thinking. And so we have just been trained from the time we were tiny children that we're in a fight, that we're in a battle, and that we've got to be David against Goliath and stand up against the crowd. How many youth group, sermons were told about standing up against the crowd and don't go along with the crowd. And so we may have these Harvard-trained intellectuals in our Christian universities, but we're not going to believe them because they represent the crowd. They represent everything outside the evangelical walls. And so they're automatically suspect. It's like a badge of honor to stand up against these intellectual elites.
Yeah,
Even though we
no, it's
want them in our university.
point.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a weird dynamic. And the thing I keep coming back to is it's anti-intellectual, but it's a very intellectualized idea, a version of the Christian faith. In other words, it like rejects real intellectual rigor, but its version of Christianity is like, you need to maintain these set of ideas. And therefore that cuts you off from any ability to grow intellectually or engage other people. Because by changing your mind on anything, you've already left the faith. It's like the weird way of thinking. Yeah. Well, a couple, maybe one more. We have time for one more, two more quick ones.
Okay.
You mentioned Stephen Gould. He has this concept of the non-overlapping magisteria, basically as a model of thinking of, hey, science and faith or religion, it's kind of a wrong-headed thing to think they're in competition with one another, because in many ways they're kind of having different conversations. So could they be conversation partners, and in what way? What do you share in that chapter that might be helpful for people to think about as they're processing the relationship between the two? Because we've been dealing a lot with a culture that's set up this kind of conflict model, but there are other ways of thinking about it, and this being one, kind of two different, non-competing, in many ways, non-competing conversations.
Right, exactly, and you're exactly right. Science and faith are answering different questions. They are answering different questions. And that aspect of Gould's idea of non-overlapping magisteria is helpful, is useful. But I maintain they can still be in conversation to each other, that we can speak to science evidence from a community of faith, or as a person of faith. We can still speak to the evidence, but with a caveat is that I think many people do think they are speaking as people of faith into the science and to science, and we have things like doing all sorts of mental gymnastics to try to prove how there could be a literal Adam and Eve, and yet all of this human history. And so we do all of these mental gymnastics to try to just force one thing into the other. There's a whole field called concordism that tries to do just that kind of thing. And I want to make it clear that is not at all what I'm talking about. I see this conversation between science and faith, something like this, okay? Evolution is a fact. Humans share ancestry with all life on this planet, okay? That's a fact. Now, how do we rise above our natural evolutionary instincts to put ourselves first and to love our neighbor and care for the vulnerable? How do we, as creatures tied to all of life, how do we represent God as image bearers? How can we portray our very natural existence on this planet? How can we portray that in a way that's not demeaning to that origin? Or, okay, germ theory is real. We accept that germ theory is real. Now, how can churches best serve in a time of a novel viral pandemic? Do we use the money of our collections to hire attorneys so that we can keep our buildings open? Or do we use our resources to help our neighbors who can't work from home, who live in multi-generational families? Can we have honest discussions about solutions to climate problems? Speaking from our position of faith, the kind of people we are supposed to be, if we are people of faith, speaking to the science of the day, instead of just denying it or politicizing it or trying to cram it into the Bible so that it all concords together. You know, my goal in my writing, in my speaking, my passion is to say people of faith can speak to science evidence without having to make it all the same thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really well said. So it's thinking theologically about the scientific evidence, bringing a faith framework to that, and thinking through the nature of what we have in the evidence, to think about a faithful response and what God might be teaching us and doing through science, rather than determining what the evidence can and cannot say because of our faith presuppositions. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
and
good.
whether we like it or not, science is going to move on, with or without
Right.
us. Science is going to continue to progress. And if we continue to be, as believers, known as people who deny science, all we've done is take ourselves completely out of any broader conversation when we deny empirical, observable evidence. You know, I'm not going to listen to a flat earther if that person wants to tell me how best to address climate change. I'm just not going to listen to them. I'm not going to trust anything they say. You know, I'm probably not going to trust them to do my taxes, but I'm certainly not going to trust them to speak into any area of science. And so when we deny science evidence, we just admit that we really have nothing to say. You know, we may think we're sticking up for God, but really what we're doing is we're just making ourselves irrelevant in the whole conversation.
Yep. Yeah, I think that's well said. And it's ironic on an even deeper level if we look at the name evangelical, which focuses on the term gospel. What we're doing potentially is making a certain view of science or anti-scientific view the gateway to Jesus. And that's very dangerous, because that's putting up a major obstacle between anybody that wants to take mainstream science into account in their life. That they might get the impression, understandably, that they have to throw all that out in order to consider Jesus as their Lord. And that is a very scary idea, in my view. Very scary possibility.
It would be a whole other conversation about experiences I've had with that. You know, parents coming up to me after church that I've never met before that say, I heard you wrote a book. Would you be interested in talking to my teenager? You know, because they have these teens that are who are smart, science-oriented teens, and they are understanding that what they feel they must believe according to their church or their youth group is not what they are learning in science. And you know what?
Yeah.
They're not going to jettison the science. They're going to jettison the faith. If they're made to feel that they have to make a choice, it's not the science that gets jettisoned.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's well said. Okay, I got to ask you one more thing before I let you go. I want to respect your time, but just because of the nature of the book and the aim, I think it would the last place to go here would be any practical advice that you have for people in evangelical circles who are trying to reframe the conversation, right? So this could be pastors, people in church, people working at Christian universities, colleges, any place that there's a dominant strand of the culture, maybe even the majority, that is committed to an anti-scientific way of approaching the data. What advice do you have for people to begin to make positive steps towards reformation, maybe starting conversations, productive conversations with colleagues or people in a church?
Well, I think maybe to begin with is just to identify how we have conflated science with the culture war, and how much of our opposition to science is actually an opposition to what we see as ills of the culture. And so I think just identifying the problem, identifying what's going on, and understanding, like so many things, how we got to where we are today. Understanding that history that began in the early 20th century and continues on into the 21st century with making science into a front in the culture war. I think it's important for us to understand the difference between someone who is an authority and someone who is an expert, someone who presents themselves as an authority figure, speaking to should or not take a COVID vaccine, should you or should you not advocate for solutions to our climate problem. Are these people speaking as authority figures, or are they speaking as people who are experts? And at the very least, are they speaking as someone who is within the consensus of a field of experts? And I think that's a broader problem outside of faith communities. It's just a lack of science literacy and understanding how science works. And I think, but just on a basic level, a pragmatic level, just understanding a difference between someone who is an authority figure and someone who is actually an expert in a field or is speaking within the consensus of experts. And just understanding that, science is not going to give you the certainty that pseudoscience is going to give you. Pseudoscience, drink this supplement and your migraines will be gone, 100%. Take this vaccine and it's going to change your DNA. There's no equivocation there. But science doesn't speak like that. Science speaks about the best evidence that we have at the time, the best evidence at hand. And so the knee-jerk reaction to say, well, look at those scientists, they're always flip-flopping. One time they tell us to wear a mask, and then they tell us not to wear a mask. But again, that's just a misunderstanding of how science works. And I think, it's not a small task, but I think it can be done. If, we understand how we got to where we are, how we have made science a front in the culture war, how we've trained ourselves over decades of fighting evolution to distrust science and to distrust scientists just out of hand. I think that would be a huge step forward because, like I said, one of my big passions is that we are making too many people feel like, they have to make a choice between their faith and either accepting science or even going into a science field. And they're not choosing their faith if they're being told it's a dichotomy. They aren't going with the faith. And I'll just say this one other thing that, you said, what could faith leaders, one thing that faith leaders could know and to do. For decades, denying evolution wasn't life-threatening. I could argue that it was faith-threatening, but it wasn't life-threatening. But along comes a COVID pandemic, and science denial became literally life-threatening. And I can't help but wonder, how long the COVID pandemic was extended. How many more people died? How many more people got sick or hospitalized because this huge, 40% of our demographic, white evangelical Christians, denied the science of COVID, refused to take a vaccine, actively spoke against the vaccine, actively spoke against any precautions for cultural and political reasons. I can't help but think, how long was it extended because of the response of very many people of faith. And so our science denial has moved into a whole new ballgame. We aren't just it's not just a threat to people's faith. Our science denial is a threat to people's well-being and even their lives.
Yeah. No, that's well said. And that's, I think, a good place for us to end. But just what I hear you saying is, well, one, the stakes are very high. We need to be having these conversations. But also, any way we can create space in our communities for a robust, realistic conversation about our tradition, where some of these ideas come from, why we're at the place we're at. So a bit of an autopsy, historical autopsy, that's an important thing for us to do, and to be having those conversations. I wholeheartedly agree. I honestly, I wish that every evangelical Christian could have an American church history class or an American religions class at some point, even in church. That for me in seminary was so eye-opening when I began to see all of these figures and like, oh my gosh, that's why we do that in church. No one ever did that before, but because of so-and-so, we do this and that. And it's just really helpful to be able to make those connections and kind of see there's a lot of long tradition of cultural ideological undercurrent underneath all of this stuff. And Yeah, thanks for helping us unpack the book. Thanks for your clarity in writing, and just for being such a good writer. It was an enjoyable book to read, so really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Ray. Yeah, so everybody go out and get the book, it's God of Monkey Science, and you'll enjoy it. A lot of great questions in the back that you can discuss as well. Thanks again, Dr. Ray. We appreciate you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please make sure you subscribe using the link below and check out some more of our videos.